Israel Finkelstein is a leading figure in the archaeology and history of ancient Israel. Over 40 years of fieldwork and research, he has helped to change the way archaeology is conducted, the Bible is interpreted, and the history of Israel is reconstructed. I sat down with Israel over several sessions to talk about how a lifetime of work has informed the story of ancient Israel. Okay, today we're going to be talking about the end of the Late Bronze Age civilization that we spent last episode discussing. In the 12th century, the Late Bronze Age world collapsed. Let's talk about what the significance of this transition is, specifically for setting up the rise of ancient Israel.
So we absolutely need to look at the collapse in order to understand what came next, and the collapse is essential. But first we have to understand what was there before. So it is really important to make a contrast between the situation, let's say, in the middle of the 13th century BC and the situation, let's say, around 1100. So we are comparing 1250 to 1100 BC. 1250, the old world as it used to be, the age of the empires, and a strong Egyptian empires, a strong Hittite empire, Mycenaean palaces in Greece, Cyprus, Alasia, that was the name of the place, was the exporter of copper all around the Eastern Mediterranean. Important city-states in Canaan, important emporia of trade on the coast like Ugarit in the north. This is 1250, the world of the empires. By 1100 BC, there was nothing left of this world, nothing at all. There was no Hittites. There was no Egypt anymore as an empire. There were no city-states in Canaan as they used to be, or definitely not Ugarit. Alasia was not that important anymore, and so on. Instead, we have a situation of reorganization, which at the end of the process will lead to the rise of a new order of territorial kingdoms, for a while independent of great empires ruling over them for a while. And we are speaking about a process, so we are not dealing here with a collapse over 1 minute. Let's say a friend of ours is describing in a wonderful book a collapse in 1177, which is good for one part of the process, but there was a longer process which started probably sometime in the late 13th century and continued for at least a century until the whole thing came down.
How does this happen? I mean, we see this periodically throughout human history, something great like the Late Bronze Age imperial system, a global system with international trade and great wealth spread all around the Mediterranean and Near East. How does that come to an end?
Exactly. This is maybe the most dramatic single collapse in the history of the old world, for sure, maybe in the history of the world. This is the crisis, the big collapse of the great empires of the old world. When I speak to my students, I tell them, listen, you need to compare this to something big as what happened in the beginning of the 20th century after the First World War. The entire system changed completely. But this was even more dramatic because they disappeared completely. I mean, the empires of the past. So there were attempts to understand this, to give explanations from the very beginning. People were looking into either historical processes, but then partially explaining the system, because historical process can explain, a situation in Canaan, a situation in Cyprus, a situation in Greece or in Anatolia, but not the big picture of the entire collapse of the system in the Eastern Mediterranean. And at a certain point, scholars started looking at a crisis which was connected to some sort of natural forces. So at a certain moment they spoke about a storm of earthquakes and things like this. But slowly, in fact, starting in the 60s of the 20th century, there were voices raising the possibility of climate change.
Climate change, it's all the rage these days. How can you even begin to discuss climate change 3,000 years ago?
So first of all, I need to tell you, Matt, and I think that you feel like me. When I came to the university, you came later than me, many years later than me. But when I came to the university, they told me, listen, all the evidence shows that in the last 5,000 years, there was no big change, climate change in our region. But we know today that this is not correct. So this is something, change of paradigm also in the last, 15, 20, 25 years in research. So how do we know about climate change? What brought about, this thinking that there was a problem with climate behind this collapse of the 13th and 12th centuries BC? The reason is that we turned into different archaeoscience fields, and some of them started giving us information. The most important of them all is pollen research. What is pollen? We are looking for pollen in the air, and the pollen in the air, in fact, gives us information about the vegetation around us. So we sit here with the wonderful cypress trees around us, and other trees around us, and I suppose that there is pollen in the air which will provide information about the vegetation here in Jerusalem today, right? The same goes for antiquity. The question is how to know about pollen in antiquity. The way to go about this is to go to lakes. Why lakes? Because in lakes, in deep lakes especially, the pollen sinks into the bottom of the lake and sits there quietly without currents disturbing the sediments. And then if we come and drill into the sediments at the bottom of the lake and take a core of sediments outside, and the core, in fact, discloses, the history of sediments and history of pollen in the air above the lake or around the lake, in the surroundings of the lake in antiquity. All we need to know is to be able to date the core and to count and identify pollen in the core. And this is what we are doing. So several teams worked about this in recent years. There is a very strong French team who worked in Syria before the crisis in Syria and in Cyprus. And we have our own team. We worked here in the capacity of a big European Research Council research funded by them a few years ago. The leading scholar in this team was Daphna Langut, who is now at Tel Aviv University, an archaeobotanist.
So how does pollen translate into information about climate?
So pollen translates to vegetation around the place where you took the core from. And the vegetation translates to climate, because we are looking at, for instance, the ratio between arboreal and non-arboreal vegetation, which means trees and the other vegetation, small vegetation and so on. And we can see vegetation which is more desert-like, which is more steppe-like, or vegetation which signifies a period with lots of precipitation, lots of rain, green and so on and so forth. This is exactly what pollen tells us. And when we look at the chart that is produced by the core that we took, for instance, from the Sea of Galilee, and the same results from Cyprus and from Syria, we see something very dramatic. We worked also in maybe a little bit better resolution for the period that we are speaking about. So we see basically the most radical crisis, climate crisis, in the history of this country, in the Bronze and Iron Ages, in the period of time between 1250 and 1100 BC. Exactly the period of the collapse of the city-states in Canaan and of these empires around us, what we know from the textual material of the ancient Near East. So, a big crisis.
So, the pollen in the air lands on the lake, sinks to the bottom, and at the bottom of a lake should be stratified layers of pollen over time.
Yes, we need to look for organic material along the core in order to radiocarbon date these samples, and then by having a few samples along the core, and then by looking also at the lamina, in the core, we can really reconstruct almost, maybe not year by year, but We, for instance, worked in a resolution of a sample every 20-25 years, which was really unheard of before, and which gave us a lot of information.
So it works a lot like archaeology. You identify the layer, you date the layer with some sort of radiocarbon, and then you count the pollen inside of that layer.
Yeah, like you look at the material culture of the layer. So in
Sure.
this case, you look at the pollen.
Right. So if I find that there is tons of olive pollen in one particular layer
Yeah.
and less of some other type of thing, I can start to talk about the vegetation of a region. How would you define this major change in climate? Are things getting wetter, drier, snowier? What's going on?
Exactly. So this is a wonderful question because we are sitting, let's say, shift ourselves from Jerusalem, which is more problematic from the point of view of climate, to Tel Aviv or to Megiddo. The two of us work at Megiddo, so we know very well the environment of Megiddo. You sit at Megiddo and let's say the average precipitation is somewhere around 550, 600 millimeters per year. Drop 20%. You get to what? 500. Well, you can manage. No big
Crops are going to be the same.
Yeah, one can manage. However, please remember that we are surrounded here in the Levant by steppe regions on two sides. So we have the sea on one side in the west, in the east, desert, in the south, desert. And many of the important places are located on the desert fringe. Amman in Jordan gets something like 250, 300 millimeters per year. Damascus gets something between 250 and 300 millimeters per year. So if you take Megiddo down by 20%, nothing happens. If you take Damascus down by 20%, you have a catastrophe, basically, because then the whole thing starts collapsing. And you know, by the way, that some people think and speak about it, and there were many scholarly articles pro and con this notion that the crisis that we see in Syria today, in recent years, is the product of several continuous years of droughts in Syria on the desert fringe 20, 15 years ago.
So when we talk about the collapse of late Bronze Age society from Greece to Mesopotamia, and we talk about climate change, we have to understand, as you are suggesting, that climate change impacts different regions in different ways. But because this entire world was such an integrated system, that the collapse in certain parts could cascade to other parts.
Yes, exactly. This is maybe one of the most important points to stress. The late bronze system was a system that was well connected from Greece in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, and from Anatolia in the north to Egypt in the south. Connected by trade, by diplomatic relations, and by the entire economic system of globalization of the Egyptian empire, perhaps, and so on. And once, you know, the system starts collapsing, then started a domino effect which brought the entire world of the Bronze Age down at the end of the 12th century BC.
So the pollen evidence strongly indicates that there was increasing dryness in the desert margins, which began to impact some very important city-states, such as Damascus,
Right.
Amman.
Yeah.
What other lines of evidence can we look at that would help us understand this moment in time?
So so first of all, we need to remember, and we spoke about it a little bit, but I think it's not too bad to reiterate, that we are dealing with three lines of evidence that go together very well and point to the period of time between 1250 and 1100 BC. One is the pollen evidence for a dramatic climate crisis, dry period, at least in the Levant and around us. The second piece of information is simply the history of destruction of cities. The entire destruction of cities and states in the region started sometime in the beginning of the 12th century. Let's say Ugarit in the north collapsed on the Syrian coast, the big emporium there on the coast. was destroyed sometime in the very beginning of the 12th century, and then continuously until the late 12th century. Megiddo, where the two of us are working, you remember the information that we have from Megiddo is very late 12th century, so 50, 60 years after Ugarit, and there are other places that were destroyed before, for instance Hatzor in the north of Israel, which was destroyed maybe in the middle or the second half of the 13th century BC. The other line of evidence is the textual material, which is very dramatic, because we do have in fact information about a crisis of drought and famine in the region. So we are not inventing something here only according to the pollen evidence. We are also reading about it in the texts of the ancient Near East. Which texts? The texts which were found in Ugarit on the coast in the north, the texts from Hatti, the Hittite Empire, texts from Emar on the Euphrates, all from the north, and they all speak about this process, about big problem with droughts that bring about famine, and they cry for help. And some of them cry for help from Egypt, because Egypt is not dictated, the climate in Egypt, by the climate of the Eastern Mediterranean, but rather by the water that comes with the Nile from the south. So they cry for help. So the problem really starts sometime in the middle of the 13th century and continues until the late 12th century BC.
What's the connection between this climate change and the destruction of all of these cities? I mean, it's not such a direct and obvious connection.
So before we explain exactly what happened, I wish to cite a study which is really essential for understanding this. And this is a study by Ronnie Ellenblum of the Hebrew University here in Jerusalem, published by Cambridge University Press a while ago, describing a comparable climate crisis in the second half of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th century CE, which means 1,000 years ago. And why is this important? Because for the 10th and 11th centuries CE, 1,000 years ago, we have a full coverage of textual material from Egypt, from Cairo, from Baghdad, from Constantinople, Istanbul, from Damascus, from all over the area. And we can really compare the records and see what happened. Now,
this is the period of the Crusades.
This is, it ends just before the Crusades, I would say. It starts around 950 and it ends around 10, according to Ellenblum, around 1070 CE. Now, Ellenblum was essential because he's working with textual material, which is gives us a full picture. When we speak about antiquity, really the Bronze Age, we do not have the full picture. He has the full picture from the textual material. And what he describes is interesting in two ways. First of all, that a part or on top, in addition to problem with precipitation, to droughts, there was a big problem with cold spells in the north. And cold spells are more deadly, more lethal than a problem of precipitation, because when one gets a cold spell, the crops are dead, all the crops. Everything is dead, the agricultural output, and people have to start moving, looking for food. There's no other way. The second, and then starts a domino effect, sort of speaking. The second issue that we need to take a look at from the perspective of the Ellenblum research is the fact that the problem is not that the rain stops for 50 years. We are not dealing with a situation like this, of course. But it becomes crucial when you get, let's say, 10 years of drought, and then there is recovery, but the recovery is not long enough. So if the recovery, let's say, is only 2 years, and then you get another set of 10 years of droughts, then you are dead. And now we can turn back to your question.
What is the connection between climate change and actual destruction? When we find that Hatzor is destroyed or Ugarit is destroyed, an entire city burned to the ground.
Yeah, so I think that we need to think about two different processes that really combine together. First one is what's going on in the north. If indeed there were cold spells in the north, So this could have pushed groups in the north to start moving southwards in search of food into other parts and then raid cities and destroy them and bring about a total unrest and collapse. The second situation is here in the Levant. Let's say Damascus, for instance. If indeed we have a situation of drop in Damascus or in Amman or in Aleppo or in Gaza or in Ashkelon in the south, those cities, big cities which are located on the desert fringe, and there starts a problem with droughts, so then slowly people start moving, and there are groups of then those, if you wish, Apiru or others, and they start raiding cities. So, you know, for us today to think about raiding a big city, we think about big armies, tanks and cannons and airplanes and whatever. This was not the situation in antiquity. For instance, in Ugarit, we get information from the text. They speak about a few ships coming, and they are terrified. Maybe each of them carrying 50, 60 warriors, and they are completely terrified because they cannot chase them quickly enough. And these people can organize and come and attack a city and destroy it in no time. And once a city is destroyed, then you have the ripple effects on the other cities in the region, and then they come down one after the other. And again, we are dealing with a process which starts sometime in the second half of the 13th century and continues for a long time. But at the end of this process, nothing is left of the old regime.
So climate change really is powerful in explaining all of the problems that are observable in the archaeological and textual record, and also in understanding why it is such a long period of time. Because climate change causes economies to become crippled, causes people to be on the move.
Yeah.
So that brings us to migrations.
Some of the processes that characterize the period, and especially what will come next in the 12th century and 11th century BC, may be connected to this. Because what are the big things that we see in the 12th century BC and into the 11th? I would say, first of all, the collapse of the Egyptian regime in Canaan and the city-states. We spoke about this. The second thing is the rise of ancient Israel in the sense of a wave of settlements in the highlands. And we need to ask ourselves, why? What happened? Where are they coming from, these people? And the third thing is the settlement of the sea people. We will get to this later in our conversations. The settlement of the sea people on the southern coast or along the coast of the Levant.
One of the oldest textual sources for this period is the famous Egyptian inscription of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, in which he refers to what sounds like an invasion of peoples of the sea. And the sea peoples has been part of the discussion of the collapse of the Bronze Age since the beginning. How do we connect the sea peoples with climate change and migrations?
So I think that it is not a coincidence that all this happens in the 12th century in the middle of the big crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we have these groups that settle along the coast of the Levant, and they pose some sort of difficulty to Egypt. We will speak about it when we really have a discussion of the sea people later in the series. But they caused a problem to Egypt. And there is reason to believe that these groups were pushed to migration because of the climate crisis, because of droughts in the north or the cold spells that I refer to, because people started pushing from the north southwards, and all these domino effects started rolling and groups started moving. Now, we are not speaking, of course, when we look at the records of Ramesses III about, you know, tens of thousands of people invading the coast of Canaan. I saw once an article in the National Geographic magazine in the 50s, and there was a picture which reminded me, a drawing, which reminded me very much of the memory of Normandy, you know, 15 years before the publication of that article. We are not in a Second World War situation of an invasion from the sea of tens of thousands of people, but hundreds here and hundreds there came in ships, settled along the coast, caused some problems along the coast, and they were part of the migration and movement of people. Some of these movements came from outside and some were local.
So before we continue to our discussion of the Israelites, there's still some very interesting questions here. We know that at the end of this process, the Egyptian Empire is gone. We've talked about the Sea Peoples, we've talked about climate change, we've talked about other migrations. What were the Egyptians doing in the face of these new challenges?
So Egypt was a big empire and it was well administered. So I don't see the Egyptians sitting here and doing nothing. And in fact, there is, for the first time in the last 10, 15 years, information to show us that the Egyptians tried to react, that they noticed that something was going on, and that something poses problems to their empire, to their grip over these territories, both in Canaan and along the coast. And the inscriptions of Ramesses that you mentioned a few minutes ago are connected to this. So we now have evidence from archaeology, and maybe even from pollen, to show that the Egyptians at a certain point in the 12th century or even the very late 13th century started shifting the agriculture, at least here in Canaan, into a different system directed at producing more grain in order probably to supply grain to the steppe regions. So we see this at Megiddo in the animal husbandry evidence which comes from archaeology, more cows for plowing the fields, and more sickle blades at the end of the late Bronze Age. And we see this in the growing evidence for pollen that comes from grain in the Sea of Galilee. And we see this in a very interesting piece of evidence about introduction of zebu cattle into the region. We get this from ancient DNA investigation that I was involved with Meirav Meiri, a researcher from Tel Aviv University, doing the actual work, showing that they tried to introduce animals which were more adapt to dry areas in order to support the agriculture of the country. And in fact, when we look at the evidence, we see that they were successful, at least for a while, because in the north, the collapse can be dated to the beginning of the 12th century, around, let's say, 1180, 85 BC, whereas in the south, the final collapse came only 50, 60 years later. So they managed, in fact, to postpone the collapse for at least half a century.
So where do the Israelites fit in?
Well, so why did we do all this? Why did we speak about the crisis? We spoke about the crisis to say the following, that we see this wave of settlement, strong settlement in the highlands, starting sometime in the late 13th century, continuing in the 12th century, and peaking, I suppose, in the 11th century BC. And this too, I think, is climate related. And why am I saying this? Because the economy, the local economy of Canaan in the Bronze Age was established on this system that has sedentary people and pastoral nomads. And the pastoral nomads can engage in pastoral nomadism and supply their products to the city dwellers only because the city dwellers and the villages can supply them with grain. And the grain must come from the surplus of grain in the fields of these city-states. Now, once a crisis starts and the city-states cannot supply enough grain, this must push the pastoral nomads to settle down. And because we think that for other reasons, and we will be speaking about it later, that the early Israelites, at least some of them, settled down, came from pastoral nomadic background, maybe the crisis pushed them to settle down because there was not enough surplus of grain to support them. And another point that needs to be stressed is that unlike other periods when a climate crisis ends with getting back to normal, what we see in the record of the Sea of Galilee, the pollen record, is that after this crisis in the 11th century, we are entering a phase which was wetter than the normal in the region, and this could have enabled the people in the highlands to establish themselves in a more agricultural formation system in the 11th century BC.
In our next episode, we could delve a little bit deeper into what is going on in the highlands in the aftermath of this crisis.
Yes, we are going to do this and speak about the early Israelites.
Great.